Civilian predator stings are driven by urgency, but urgency is not authority. So, in recent years now, more and more civilian groups have taken it upon themselves to confront suspected online predators using decoys, arranging meetups, and conducting these sting style confrontations. All the while, cameras are rolling. Civilian predator stings are driven by urgency, but urgency is not authority. So, in recent years now, more and more civilian groups have taken it upon themselves to confront suspected online predators using decoys, arranging meetups, and conducting these sting style confrontations. All the while, cameras are rolling. And a lot of this is motivated by a real and an understandable fear: crimes against children. And many people doing this do believe that they're protecting kids. Now, before I go any further, I just want to be precise about language because precision does matter on this topic. Throughout the episode, you'll hear me use the word pedophile deliberately, not casually, and not as a legal verdict. I'm using that word because many of the civilian groups we're discussing explicitly claim to be targeting adults who seek sexual contact with children. But the word predator can mean a lot of things, but pedophile has a specific meaning in clinical settings, and it carries an enormous weight socially and legally. And clarity matters to me. So, first off, not every person confronted on camera has been legally proven to be anything. Some are suspects, some are alleged offenders, some are ultimately charged, but many are not. And that distinction is exactly where the danger begins. So, on this episode, I'm not defending offenders, and it's certainly not about dismissing civilians' concerns for children. This is about what happens when confrontations replace investigations, when the priority becomes exposure instead of evidence, and when civilian stings start to collide with criminal law, criminal procedure, and public safety. Now, as a retired NYPD detective squad commander, I've seen how fragile prosecutions can be. Detectives work with prosecutors to build cases around lawful evidence that holds up under scrutiny, because a bad investigation doesn't just fail. A bad investigation can end up protecting the offender, and we certainly don't want that. So tonight, we're going to look at the part of civilian predator catching that isn't talked about enough because, frankly, it's uncomfortable, and because it complicates the good guys versus the bad guys story. We're also going to examine the psychological dynamics between these stings, why they're spreading, why they're profitable, and why, in many cases, they create risks that outweigh the benefits. Civilian predator catcher groups often operate with a moral urgency, and they're fueled by public fear, but they do so without legal authority. They do so without investigative safeguards that us detectives have to use, and with very limited accountability. And that combination produces some predictable consequences. Here's some of them: cases that collapse quietly in a prosecutor's office, evidence that civilians gather, but it becomes unusable, suspects who, as a result of the civilian sting, delete their accounts, they destroy devices. Sometimes there's confrontations that escalate into violence. Also, what I think is a very important item is the civil liability that can financially destroy the people doing the confronting. So more about that a little later in the episode. But civilian predator catcher content is trending, gains attention, builds influence, can also become profitable. And it's often framed as justice. But real justice doesn't operate on views. Investigations don't operate on clicks. And courtrooms do not accept viral as a standard of proof. What we're seeing is the convergence of three forces. One, public fear and anger, especially around crimes involving children. Two, social media algorithms that reward confrontation and outrage. Three, monetization, the clicks, donations, subscriptions, and the influence. I'm not analyzing this through a moral lens. I want to look at it through an investigative one. So let's ask some questions. Who has the legal authority to investigate? How is evidence preserved? What happens to prosecutions after the public exposure as a result of the civilian stings? And who bears responsibility when things go wrong? So to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where this format entered the public consciousness for many people. A lot of you are going to remember the series with Chris Hansen, To Catch a Predator. Now, that show didn't invent the concern about child exploitation, but what it did do is popularize a very specific model: confrontation, cameras, and public exposure. And this is important. Remember, this was a television production first and a law enforcement operation second. Even when the police were involved, the incentives weren't purely investigative, they were also entertainment. And when entertainment enters a criminal operation, the priorities can shift. So let's fast forward to today now. We're now seeing this format revived on streaming platforms and replicated across YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. But what often doesn't carry over from television to social media are the important safeguards. Civilian predator stings don't have any editorial oversight. They don't have a legal bureau that can scrutinize what they're doing from a legal review standpoint. There's no coordination with investigators, detectives, and there's really no accountability when things go wrong. And when the host becomes the centerpiece and the confrontation becomes the product, then the mission changes. It stops being documentation and it starts to become replication. Over time, something else happened. The focus shifted. What began as an exposure of these offenders increasingly became centered on that host, the confrontation, the dialogue, the performative justice, performance. That shift matters because when the camera and the host become the point, then the priority shifts. And that shift didn't stop when network television did. So here's the really hard truth, and this is where all good intentions stop mattering. Good intentions do not create legal authority. Now, many civilian groups will tell you they're doing this to protect children, and some may genuinely believe that, but belief isn't a legal standard. Law enforcement investigations are slow, controlled, and they're often frustrating, and for a reason. I could tell you in my experience how many times all this came to be true. Slow, frustrating, certainly. But because once a case enters the criminal justice system, it doesn't matter how convincing something looks on camera. What matters is whether it survives scrutiny in a court of law. When civilians confront suspected offenders on camera, they risk a few things. One, contaminating evidence. Two, triggering entrapment and inducement arguments. Three, destroying digital trails. Four, pushing suspects underground and also jeopardizing future prosecutions. Escalation, including violence without legal protection, tactical training, or any backup. Before I go further, what I want to do is explain what entrapment is, because I want you to really understand the definition and why it's responsible for getting somebody's cases tossed. Entrapment occurs when a person is induced or persuaded to commit a crime they were not already predisposed to commit by someone acting as an agent of law enforcement or by conduct that closely mimics it. It's about whether the idea to commit the crime came from the suspect or whether it was manufactured through pressure, persuasion, or escalation by someone else. So when civilians escalate conversations, they start to introduce sexual topics, push the meetings that may not have occurred otherwise, then risk crossing a line that prosecutors and judges and defense counsel certainly take a good look at, and they take it very seriously. The key issue isn't whether the act looks wrong on camera, it's whether the criminal intent originated with the suspect or was created by the person pushing the interaction. Entrapment isn't about letting someone off the hook. This isn't hypothetical. These outcomes are documented and recurring. Now, this episode is about putting the predator-catcher culture under some professional scrutiny, not to excuse criminal behavior, but to examine whether these practices protect children or whether they're creating new risks under the cloak of justice. So let's talk about authority. Who has it, who doesn't, and why that distinction exists in the first place. When people ask why law enforcement doesn't conduct investigations the way civilian predator-catcher groups do, the answer is simple. Police investigations operate under constitutional constraints, evidentiary rules, and accountability mechanisms. Those constraints aren't obstacles, they're safeguards, because the purpose of an investigation is not a confrontation. The purpose is a conviction that holds up in court and protects the public. Authority exists for a reason. The police are trained to, first of all, de-escalate situations if they become or they're heading to be something that's violent. Police investigations, you're going to always preserve evidence, control these scenes, protect people, bystanders, and most importantly, document everything. Civilian groups have none of that. And they have no obligation to answer when things go wrong. Yet the consequences don't stop with them. There's a ripple effect that creates a downward spiral insofar as building a case. And when cases fail, or evidence disappears, or violence erupts, there's another layer of harm that rarely gets discussed. How are we supposed to feel about the families of the offenders, the parents, the siblings, the spouses, the children? Could they have done something to prevent the family member from going from maybe what started as fantasy into what became a grotesque reality? Are we supposed to feel bad for them that they have somebody in their family that is a criminal, a predator, a pedophile? So in the next segment, I'm going to walk through a composite case drawn from real-world example, and I'm going to ask a difficult question without labeling or permanent damage, because once a word like pedophile is applied publicly, there aren't any appeals. There's no process. Now, evidence is not a confession on YouTube. Evidence is not the confrontation. Evidence is not a viral clip. What evidence has to be is authenticated, preserved, collected lawfully, properly documented, and free from coercion. Anything less isn't just weak, it can be actually destructive to a case, because bad evidence doesn't just fail. Bad evidence can actually protect the offender. We don't want that to happen. Now, I think it's important for you to know some actual cases with these civilian stings. What worked, what didn't, and why. So there was a federal case in the Midwest, late 2000s, and it was this online enticement of a minor by a predator. The outcome of it was an arrest, a prosecution, and a conviction. A civilian group operating online encountered communications involving an adult attempting to engage what he believed to be a minor. But here's the critical distinction in this case. The civilians did not confront the individual. They did not arrange the meeting. They did not record a confrontation. What they did instead, and this is really important because we're talking about the care and concern of groups that want to make an impact, that want to do something. So what did they do that made this case successful? They took what they had, They forwarded the information to law enforcement and then they disengaged. Federal investigators didn't rely on the civilian communications. What they did was agents independently identified the suspect, recreated the online interactions under controlled conditions, obtained warrants, seized devices, and built the case from the ground up. So the civilian group didn't participate in the arrests. Their messages were not used as primary evidence, and no confrontation occurred. The result, a conviction. The procedural success point, law enforcement now rebuilt the case based on what the civilians informed them. Thanks to the initial civilian involvement, the case was successful because law enforcement removed the civilians from the investigative process. Another case, we were talking about entrapment before, and I gave you the definition. In southern U.S. states, instead of citing one particular case, there are several that happened across the southern U.S. between 2017 and 2021. These were what they called at the time civilian pedo hunter YouTube stings. The outcome of all of these cases were that the charges were either declined or dismissed. So again, across multiple southern jurisdictions, prosecutors reviewed cases submitted by civilian predator catching groups and declined prosecution due to inducement and evidentiary contamination. In one case, a civilian group engaged an adult online for weeks. During that time, what the civilians did was they introduced sexual topics. They escalated the conversation. They pushed for a meeting. They framed responses through leading questions. Only after the confrontation was filmed and uploaded did law enforcement receive the tip. So prosecutors reviewing the material identified several what would become fatal problems. The civilian initiation of sexual content, the lack of proof of the suspect's intent, the statements made under public confrontation pressure. There was no independent law enforcement verifications. So what happened? Defense counsel raised entrapment and inducement arguments immediately, and as a result, what happened? No charges were filed. No public announcement followed. The case simply disappeared. And the reason it failed was because civilian escalation created an inducement risk, and it wound up destroying prosecutorial viability. So these cases don't necessarily fail publicly. They fail quietly inside prosecutors' offices long after that video goes viral. So although the civilian predator groups may very well be well-intentioned, try their best to expose that type of criminal behavior, what winds up happening is that the cases are dismissed. So was justice ever really served? Is the embarrassment of the offender the justice, or do those people belong in jail for a very long time to get them off the street? Another case in the Northeast in the late 2010s, another civilian public confrontation. What happened? No arrest, and there was no prosecution. Civilian group publicly confronted a suspected offender in a parking lot. The interaction was filmed and rapidly circulated online. The individual was not arrested that day. Within 48 hours, this guy's online accounts were deleted, his phones were replaced, his computers were discarded, and every bit of communication history that he had vanished. When law enforcement later received the tip, there was nothing that was recoverable that could be used as evidence. Nothing. No devices, no accounts, no corroboration, no case, right? So this public exposure warned the suspect, and it triggered evidence destruction before any warrants could be obtained. So exposure doesn't just shame someone, it also alerts them. And once that digital evidence is gone, it's gone. Another one, in January of 2023, a civilian predator catcher known online confronted a man in public as part of a sting operation. The situation escalated, the confrontation turned violent, and the civilian participant was shot and killed. Law enforcement responded to a homicide scene, not an investigation involving minors. The focus immediately shifted to use of force, self-defense claims, and public safety. No charges related to child exploitation were ever filed. Uncontrolled civilian confrontation created a foreseeable escalation scenario. Now, without authority, without backup, and without the ability to create scene control, bad things happen. But violence in these encounters isn't just an anomaly. It's a predictable outcome when civilians conduct confrontations without training and legal authority. Now, if we look at that Dateline episode back in 2006 with Chris Hansen, there was an episode that resulted in the subject committing suicide, and that resulted in civil litigation against the network. In this episode of To Catch a Predator, the operation resulted in identifying someone who was actually an assistant district attorney named Bill Conrad, and he died by suicide before he could be arrested. I believe he shot himself in the head. The incident now prompted national scrutiny, internal law enforcement criticism, and also wrongful death lawsuit against NBC that was later settled out of court. Now, while the operation involved police presence, investigators later acknowledged that the pressure created by media involvement and public confrontation were significant. So, what's the takeaway from this? The takeaway is when confrontation replaces control, the outcomes can become unpredictable and sometimes irreversible. Investigators, detectives in general, they want suspects talking, but under controlled conditions. They want devices preserved before they're wiped. They want accounts intact before they're deleted. These civilian confrontations, they do the opposite. They force suspects into defense mode. They accelerate the suspect's move to lawyering up. Now, remember before I said I would come back to this, there's a consequence that we sometimes overlook that civilian predator catcher groups rarely address. And it doesn't happen in criminal court. It happens in civil court because civil court asks a different question. They don't ask, was the behavior inappropriate? They ask, did your actions cause harm? And civil liability can result from a number of things: misidentification, false labeling, the reputational damage that it can cause an individual, harassment and doxing fallout, what they'll identify as unlawful detention or restraint, conduct that leads to assault during these confrontations, and monetization tied to these public accusations. So I want to do another definition again. We spoke about entrapment. I want to talk about this word doxing. We hear doxing a lot today, right? Now, doxing overall is a fairly new word. It was first became a known word like in the 1990s into 2000, but started becoming more frequently used after 2010. So what is doxing? You should know this too, especially because it's used today. Doxing refers to the public release of someone's private identifying information, such as their home address, their workplace, family details, or contact information without consent. It's often framed as exposure, but in practice, it can lead to harassment, threats, job loss, physical danger for people who were never charged with a crime. Now, it's dangerous because once private information is released online, there's really no way to control how it's used. Law enforcement avoids public disclosure for this exact reason. Civilian groups that publish identifying details, intentionally or not, can create serious safety risks and civil liability, even when no criminal charges exist. And in civil court, the threshold is different. The plaintiff doesn't have to prove they were innocent of everything. All they have to prove is damages, which means that even these very well-intentioned civilians can face real financial consequences. Here's an interesting composite case. I'll call it the 1815 question, as it relates to proportionality and labeling. So let me walk you through a scenario drawn from recurring real world patterns. So an 18-year-old, a 15-year-old. Is the conduct illegal? Yes. Is it inappropriate? Sure. And does it require accountability? Yeah. But here's the question, and I think it matters. Does that automatically make the 18-year-old a pedophile? Or does it reflect something that's a serious situation involving teenagers that still requires proportional handling and careful legal classification? Because once the label pedophile is applied publicly, it becomes permanent. There's no correction, there's no context, there's no appeal. And that's one of the most dangerous parts of civilian exposure, this culture that's happening today. It flattens everything into one category, and the justice system cannot function if everything is treated as identical, if everything is put into the same bucket. Now, pedophilia is not a casual word. It describes a specific sexual fixation, and it carries a stigma that never goes away. When civilian groups flatten every case into that same label, they erase critical distinctions between fixation and behavior, between predatory behavior and immaturity, between criminal investigation and public shaming. And those distinctions are exactly what the justice system is designed to sort out. Let me talk briefly about psychology of the predator catcher. Okay, to understand why this continues despite the risks, you have to look at the psychology of the people doing the confronting. Some start with sincere concern, but once views, praise, donations, and attention follow confrontation, incentives shift. The restraint erodes. The mission can drift from prevention to being performative. And once that shift happens, the risk increases, not decreases. So what actually protects children? Because none of what I've said in this episode is about minimizing harm to children. Protecting children is the priority, but that protection requires discipline, not spectacle. It requires evidence preservation, controlled operations, lawful investigative standards, trained detectives who have the authority and the accountability. Civilian stings try to provide a layer of child safety against these predators in a world that feels increasingly dangerous. Now, these predators are out there, and they do create a danger to our children. And our children need to be aware of the warning signs. But sometimes the predator catcher sting operations result in wrongful identification, refusal to prosecute, and having good intentions result in being sued. Because once a life is exposed online, you can't hit an undo button. Exposure isn't justice. Confrontation isn't investigation. And clicks aren't convictions. In part 2, we're going to step away from the cameras and the confrontations and take a deeper look at the psychology of the pedophile, how fantasy can escalate into behavior that becomes reality and results in victims. We're going to look at grooming patterns. We're going to take a look at what risk factors matter and what prevention actually requires. I'm Mike Blangiforti. Thanks for tuning in to Truth, Investigations, and Criminal Behavior. Now, if you prefer audio-only listening, this episode is available on all major podcast platforms. Have a great night.